All right, welcome back. We are back and better than ever. We are a week removed from the Melbourne Grand Prix, home to our very own co-host Shez. He is going to be out there taking all that that track has to offer, and I look forward to chatting with him at various points during the weekend or after the Melbourne Grand Prix has consumed him and and farted him out on the side.
What?
But no, you're gonna have a great time. Come on.
I hope
Uh,
so.
so as we move into the Melbourne Grand Prix and as we move into the season, Shez, one of the things that's been on my mind is where Max Verstappen is going this year, and then where does that fit into the broader picture, right? So I think it's fair to assume that Max will win most races this year, if not all of them. It's also not a big gamble to make to say that Max will win the championship this year. So I'm walking into this discussion and this question for you with the assumption that he's going to win this year. Now, I don't know if he's going to win all races or not, but he's going to win his fourth championship, fourth consecutive, by the way. And then he joins a very small, tiny group of elite Formula One drivers that include Lewis Hamilton, Michael Schumacher, Juan Manuel Fangio, Sebastian Vettel, and Alain Prost, right? So he would be the sixth driver to have four drivers' championships or more. And so I want to ask you this question, which is, once he wins his fourth championship,
The
is Max allowed
foregone
to be
conclusion.
as a foregone conclusion, right? Once he wins that, is he now firmly in the top five greatest F1 drivers of all time list? Why or why not?
Uh, yeah, that's a good question, and I think we need to discuss it before I can make a firm conclusion to this because I don't think it's that straightforward. I think there's some basic tenets that we can both probably agree on. The first is the bare facts that he's breaking records right, left, and center, and that to me tells me that he's a driver that has been afforded an opportunity and is absolutely grabbing that opportunity with both hands and making the most of it, which is what you would expect an absolute top line great driver to do. Um, but it's difficult, I think, at this stage in his career to kind of say he falls into that top five category. The assumption that I'm going to make is that when we get to the end of his career or into the twilight years of his career, and we kind of see that we look back and we see what he has done, that probably he will be within that. But for me, at the moment, there's still a couple of unknowns that mean that it makes it difficult for me to say definitely he's going to be in that top five of all time. I think he's already in the top 10. There's no question about that. Um, but where he comes in that top 10, I think is a much more difficult question to answer. I have my own sort of personal top four or five. But that's why I think questions like this are always tricky, right? And it's not just about the classic you can't compare drivers from different eras. I agree that objectively it's really difficult to do that, but we all have our favorite drivers, right? And it is a very personal choice. So a lot of I think this discussion and a lot of any discussion that we have going forwards about who are our favorite drivers are or who are the greatest drivers, we have to acknowledge that it's a very personal discussion. It's not a this is a fact. This is just our opinion based on essentially vibes and our experience of them.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, look, I brought up Juan Manuel Fangio, but there's not a whole lot that we can learn about him because there's not a whole lot of archive footage to look at now, and there is some, but it's clearly the sport wasn't covered. I mean, it was just beginning, right, when he started, right? So the sport wasn't covered in quite the same way that it is now. The technology, the cars, the machine, the everything that goes into the sport wasn't quite the same now. So I agree with you. I mean, any discussion like this should always be more of a personal thing. And I can see that. That said, I do want to be a little bit of a prisoner of the moment, Shez, if you will, and walk me through this and see if we tend to look at the latest thing as the greatest thing, right? And I think it's worth. I mean, we went through this with the Hamilton years too, right? I mean, we had those discussions and debates well before he hit his seventh championship, and had he hit his eighth, then that would have been a completely different thing to talk about. That never happened. I know you're disappointed, but again, so you mentioned that you would like to see certain things happen in Max's career. What does that look like? Are you looking at? I've started with four championships, for example. Are you looking at a fifth? Maybe a fifth in a row. So now assuming not just this season, but let's say 2025 goes Red Bull's way and Max's way, because there's not much changing. If anything's changing in 25, does five in a row count for something?
All of it counts for something, right? So all of the different facets of this come into it, right? The bare stats mean that you're already talking about it, right? He is the defining driver of his era, just like Lewis was in his, Schumacher was, Prost and Senna were, Lauda was in his, Fangio was in his, Clark was in his. These are the benchmark drivers that everybody has to compare themselves to, and therefore they automatically become part of the conversation. And their stats are your starting point. The number of championships, the number of wins, the number of poles, all of those bare stats are what we use to try and have that conversation. But I would argue that whether he wins another title or not doesn't automatically mean that he has to get into that top five. I guess my argument for that is another four-time winner. Sebastian Vettel. For me, he doesn't enter into that conversation. Well, he's in that conversation, but he doesn't enter into my top five. Just
Fine.
because,
Yeah.
just because he for me is the archetypal right driver at the right time driver. He was able to capitalize on the Red Bull and its philosophy between 2009 really and 2013, and was able to his style and his thought process was able to absolutely make the most of that car and that concept. You could argue that that is what Max is doing right now, that he's able to absolutely capitalize
Yeah.
on what his car is able to do. I guess the reason that Max has a stronger argument, for me at least, is that he was able to show that he had competitive across two different technical regulations, right? He was able to do it before the ground effect era came along, and was able to win a championship, even before what is now becoming his defining era.
Yeah.
Whereas Sebastian wasn't really able to do that. He was solid. He was amazing in that 4-year period. And as soon as we weren't in that period anymore, and the car suddenly wasn't as good, he didn't have that advantage as much. And even in his own team, he was being challenged. Which Max, there's been a question about whether or not that's happening, right?
So
So for me, that at least is one thing that comes into it. Are you able to maintain that competitiveness across different regulations and different rule sets?
So you stated the exact reason why I wouldn't put Sebastian Vettel in that conversation, right? Which is just look at Max's teammates, right? Like, or the number of teammates he's had in this period and what's happened to them, right? Effectively. I mean, well, props to Checo for weathering the storm, so to speak, and being able to hang in there. But the reality is Max has annihilated his own teammates first and then the field in at least in these last couple of years. And part of the reason why I bring this up is it sort of goes back to, Red Bull in some ways, right? And we knew how much they struggle with the Renault engines, and one has to wonder what competition they could have given Lewis and Mercedes in those years had they had just a more reliable engine. I mean, because Max
But
was right
we
there,
know that though, don't we?
right?
Because we had 2021.
We had
We know
21, correct?
so we know what would have happened if Red Bull had had a competitive engine.
Exactly. And 2021 went to the wire, right? And I know that it ended in the way it did, but he did win it. And the reality was it went down to the last race and it went down to the last few laps. And that could have been the case for at least the previous couple years, right? And what are we talking about then? I mean, maybe Lewis doesn't get anywhere close to seven, and maybe Max already has a couple more. So I know that that is doing a lot of hypotheticals, right? But I think it's those sort of X factors that I wanted to bring to the conversation and say, okay, he has shown from a very early age to be outstanding. Whereas, as you just mentioned with Vettel, he caught lightning at the right time, right place, right time, made the most of it, so taking nothing away from him. But it's just that's the difference there.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, isn't it? But I think I think the teammate thing is interesting, because look, your job as a Formula One driver is to make your life as easy as possible,
Yeah,
right? And making your life as easy as possible doesn't mean having a seven-time world champion in the other car,
yeah,
or having a young up and coming driver in the other car that has won everything in the junior categories and is now lighting up the timesheets in Formula One.
for
That does
sure,
not make your life easier. So
sure.
why would you penalize somebody really uh, for wanting that or achieving that? I think it gives you extra points in this conversation if you were able to go up against teammates that were highly competitive and challenged you in your position in that team. But I don't think not having that makes you any less of a driver. And you can look at the contenders that I've got. So I've got Michael Schumacher in that conversation, and for all of the seasons that he was in any team, really, he had a very subservient driver as his teammate.
Yeah.
Even at Benetton, he had sort of Verstappen for a little while, he had Herbert for a little while, he had Brundle for a little while. They never had a driver that was going to absolutely challenge him for honors, although they might come close at times. And then when we went to Ferrari, he had Eddie Irvine, who, by his own admission, was there to do a support job. I'm here just to do that.
Mhm,
And Rubens was ultimately the same.
mhm.
But that doesn't diminish Michael Schumacher's achievements or that all of the other stuff that means that he has to be in that conversation. And for me, is firmly within that top 4 or 5 drivers of all time. You look at somebody like Senna, it's the same. Senna, when he was at Lotus, effectively killed off Derek Warwick's career by saying, I don't want him in my team. And it was because he was too fast. And he openly said it. Why would I want somebody in my team that means that the focus of the team isn't purely on me? And that is right, because look, for me, the pursuit of Formula One is to create that synergy that we talked about of
Mhm.
man and machine,
Machine.
not
Mhm.
human and machine. I'm really sorry. I really do mean that.
And well,
It's human and machine, right? And you're going to do everything you can to make that happen, because when that gelling happens, you get what Max is doing right now, right? So I don't blame any driver for wanting that. And I'm not going to penalize them because they didn't have teammates that ultimately challenged them. But having said that, when you do have somebody like Prost or Senna, where you can say that they
oof.
were that they were challenged in the same car by the absolute benchmark, and they came out on top. And in between 88 and 89, that swung, didn't it?
Yeah, it did.
Between Senna and Prost. So that's why those guys both have to be in my top 5.
Oh,
um, it solidifies your argument a little bit. I think it brings an extra nuance into it. It's why for me Lewis is always going to have to be in that conversation, because the caliber of the teammates that he's had to go up against and has beaten, even if there have been 3 seasons across the course of his career where he's been beaten across the season. Actually, he's taken on Fernando Alonso, the reigning and 2-time world champion, in the same car in his rookie season. Jenson Button, a reigning world champion. Nico Rosberg, who became a champion in his car. And then the up and coming drivers that have been in that seat as well. George Russell right now. We talked about where they finished last season. So although it's not the be all and end all, and perhaps one of the criticisms you could level against Lewis is that maybe he hasn't played the political game quite as well as he could have. Is that actually he's shown that against drivers of really high caliber in the same car, he's come out on top.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, so I would definitely put Lewis and Michael in that list, because I think that's sort of inarguable, right? For all the reasons that you just stated, right? And I think from there on out, I think the next three spots are up for being moved, right? Because I think there's debates to be made on either side of it. So I certainly had Lewis and Michael there. I did have Senna as well. At the moment, I have Fangio as well, because I think that there's something to be said about having won in those times, as many times as he won in that era of Formula One, which I admittedly know not a whole lot of, so I'm just going off of statistics here. But he was pretty dominant. And oh, by the way, he started doing that at the age of 39. And back then, people didn't have to be in their peak physical shape to be able to last as many seasons as you have to nowadays. So I do want to place some value points in there, right? And I'm sort of taking this off the racing circuit as well. So I would be willing to, and so I do want to kind of get back to you, because you did sort of allude to not putting Vettel in there despite being a four-time champ, only, and Max doesn't sort of qualify just on the basis of that. But you do have another four-time guy on the list too, and Alain Prost, right? And so I think that's an interesting one. That for me is the movable piece, if you will, because
He's not.
uh,
I think the problem is, I think if you look at Alain, right, he even said it. I think he said it like literally the last month that he thinks that
well,
he's probably the most underrated driver of all time.
of course he says that, but
I would have to agree with him. I know we're moving away from
it's
the
fine.
from the Max conversation a
Keep
little
it
bit, but
going.
I think I
Max
think
is
it's
in this assumption, in this world, Max has equal titles as Alain, so it's fine.
we're talking about the defining drivers of their era. So I agree that Fangio falls into that category. But if you kind of look at what Fangio did, he sort of defines that, that the greatest drivers find the greatest cars. He never did it in one team. He always managed to
Correct.
move to a team that was on the up and up or was dominant at that
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and made himself. He famously won a title at Ferrari and then left because he had such a bad relationship with them. He was there just to win a championship and then was like, I'm out. So if you want to talk about a driver sort of not necessarily showing loyalty, but being there from the beginning and building something. He never really had that. He was just the hire driver that came in and won you a title. And he
He's
was
a
El
mercenary.
Maestro.
Yeah, that's fine.
He
Yeah.
was he was El Maestro. He was the guy that was going to be able to do that for you. But again, I don't know enough about
Well,
that era to really talk about it in that much detail. And again, that speaks to why I find Alain so fascinating, and why I think he has to be in that conversation. He won four titles, but he could easily have won eight or nine. The 83 title that
yeah.
was that if it hadn't been for unreliability and the drop scores system, he should have won that title. PK should not have won the 83 title. 84, he went up against Nicky Lauda. Nicky freaking Lauda, right? Two-time world champion at Ferrari, turned up there, and you could argue that this was, you know, post his initial retirement, he's come back, he's not the same driver as he was before, but he lost that title by half a point,
Half a point. Yeah. I
right?
mean, but
And then comes back and absolutely wallops him in 85. And then in 86, again, when the McLaren was not the quickest car, he did a Kimi Raikkonen and snatched the title away from the two Williams when the Williams really should have won that season, right? And then against arguably the fastest driver of all time over one lap, he nicked a title.
yeah, I
This is not a guy. This is not a guy that you can sniff at and say, he was a journeyman. He was the guy, the linchpin that built McLaren up to where they were in the mid 80s. Like they wouldn't have been the force they were if Alain hadn't been in that car. So so he has all of those things. And even the things that I think you can point against him, he wasn't that quick. I think that's nonsense. I think he clearly recognized that Senna was just a quicker driver over one lap, but that doesn't get Senna any extra points. It was just another thing that Senna used to exert his authority or his dominance over his teammate. And it was incredible. 1.4 seconds at Monaco against your teammate is, that's something else. But that was hardly Alain driving at his absolute maximum. This was an era where you could set your car up specifically for the race. And you could see that even in that 88 race at Monaco, Senna got pole by 1.4 seconds. But who won the race?
Austin.
Where was Senna? In his hotel room. Because why? You know,
Set up the time.
his need to exert that dominance was just so great that he sometimes lost sight of what it was all about. And we can argue about why that happened, why he crashed at Portier in 1988. But Prost was the guy that was able to take it to him, and he did win a title against the fastest driver of all time in '89 in the same car. That speaks to a level of maturity and understanding and
So
knowing what you need to do.
So you're quickly convincing me that I should put Prost over Senna now, and that Senna
I
position
would.
is
I
movable,
would.
right?
I
And
would.
so the one thing so everything you said is I completely agree with you, right? The one thing I would say with what Max is doing, and I know we're building in a lot of assumptions, but he already has more race wins than Prost did, right? He's got 56. Prost had 51 total for his career. So Max is going to blow that out of the water, especially if this season goes. I mean, I think by the end of this season that'll be done. But I think his winning percentage also for Max, right? Which again, I know is a product of everything that we talked about, right? So I would place a little bit more value in there because again, we talk about harmony between the person driving the car and the car itself. And those are the other factors that we also then have to give credit for, right? And this also goes back to Fangio, by the way. He was a mercenary by design. But look, I mean, he made those decisions, right? And he was available and he did it. And you still had to race and you still had, it's not like you were just automatically given the title. So I add a little bit more value in my personal rankings when it comes to that, right? The fact that you have been able to, whether by chance or by intention, you've placed yourself in a winning situation, right? And we also should talk about Alonso here, right? Because as canny and as great as he has been, he's not always made the right decisions in
No.
picking the right teams, and
Or,
you have
or,
to
or,
wonder,
or annoyed people enough
or
that
annoyed
that
people.
they don't want
Correct.
to employ him.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
but Prost did that too. And like the number of wins that Max has partly is a function of the length of our seasons.
Correct.
He had a dominant car last
Yeah.
season that was able to win
Yeah. Agreed.
23 out of 24 races.
Yeah.
But Prost didn't have that. And we're also talking about an era where unreliability was a real thing,
Correct.
right? That
Correct.
that Prost won 51 races, where often there was sometimes a 10% finishing rate. Look at the 1996, was it 1996? Yeah, the 1996 Monaco Grand Prix.
I
Well, look what
mean,
happened there. There were what, six finishes,
yeah.
and Olivier Panis won it,
Yeah. No, I mean,
right?
I've
So,
seen plenty of archive footage to know how bad those were. Those
so,
years.
so, so the number of wins that you had available to you was
Sure.
far fewer in the era
Absolutely.
that Prost and Senna were competing in than what Max is able to achieve
Yeah.
now. And
But
again, it goes back to why it's so difficult to compare eras. But I don't
correct.
think you can purely use the stats to say that one driver is better than another. And that for me is one of them. I don't think you can use that right now to say that Max is better than Prost.
All right. I mean, that's fair. I get it. And you have right now gone on the record saying Max is not there yet. And so I keep coming back to this question of, well, what does the hypothetical look like? Where do I have to put this for you, either statistically or otherwise, where you would say, okay, now I'm willing to kind of entertain the idea of him being in the top five.
Okay, look, so I need to see this in terms of like I said, this is a very, very personal decision, right? Or a personal judgment. There's a couple of things, right? we're still kind of at the beginning or the sort of middle of Max's career. We don't see what he's done at the end of it. But there are a few things that I think put him in that conversation and put him in that top 4 or 5, and others that mean that I can't quite yet do that. The things that do are the fact that he was competitive across 2 rule sets, that he went up against
Against
the
seven times.
greatest of all time
Hmm.
in a comparable car, not the same car, but a car that was comparable and on paper beat him. That for me actually is probably the biggest thing that puts him into that top 4 or 5,
Yep.
right? Because
Mhm.
if you come back to synergy, right? If you come back to what Formula One is all about human and machine being absolutely at one, 2021 was the purest example of that. It was 2 drivers whose car was perfectly aligned with what they needed and was objectively competitive as well, right?
Yeah, but
Lewis absolutely had what he needed in his car, and Max absolutely had what he needed in his car, and they went up against each other. And Max did show that he could go toe to toe. There's no backing down, right? So and he maintained that across the whole season. There was no drop off in performance at any point. That I think is one of the defining characteristics of Max as a driver, is that he is able to be relentless and not drop off. But he was able to show that in that season, that his defining characteristics shone
yeah,
through. And that for me is why he can be within that top 4 or 5, because in that situation, in that scenario, he had full synergy with his car and he made the absolute most of it, right? Yes, that's in the pro corner. But the cons corner of this is that he's also got a few black marks against him. He in that season, I don't think his racing was particularly above board. The dive bombs, the brake testing in
oh.
Saudi, the pushing Lewis off the track in Brazil. All of those things
Silverstone,
are
no.
silver. I'm not.
Just
Let's bring
playing
it up.
devil's advocate. I know there's gonna be people in our comments hitting you up now. Okay,
Oh,
go.
you're talking about Lewis doing the same thing. I'm going to come back to that, but certainly, Max was pretty hard, and those are things that those are traits that were in his driving from the season he turned up. They had to make a Max Verstappen rule that said that you couldn't
Well, but
move twice in the braking zone because that's what he was doing. Like you go back and watch the 2016 season and just look at what Max was doing. Like his move into the chicane in Japan
so wait, but
against Vettel was just it was just madness. It wasn't Vettel, it was against Raikkonen. It was utter madness.
yeah.
And he was still doing that in 2021. So my reason for not being able to put him there just yet is that although he's not doing that now, he's now not doing it in a car in a situation where he doesn't really. There's no advantage to him putting those moves on the other driver because he knows that he can hang back and just overtake everyone anyway. Melbourne 2023 was a really good example of that. He could be beaten into the first couple of corners and knew he had the car under him to just come back. And he did the same thing against Russell in Baku. But what I want to know is, has he ironed that out a little bit? Has his risk reward calculation changed a little bit when he gets back into a competitive car? Silverstone 2021 for me is a good example of why that risk reward calculation wasn't nuanced in 2021. Because whatever you want to say about Lewis, and we can discuss Silverstone 2021 at length if you want to. I don't think we should in the time that we have available
Not
here.
today, man. Come on.
But what can't be argued is that if Max had just not, yes, you could say that, oh, he left him enough room, but he
I
also
mean,
had loads of room to leave him, and he could. The risk reward calculation that he could have made there is, if I absolutely 100% believe that if Lewis Hamilton had come through that corner first and Max Verstappen had come through second, and hadn't ended up in the wall at Cops, he would have overtaken him at some point in that race and won that race and would have ultimately won that championship. And that was a calculation that he could have made in the moment, but he didn't. He
Okay,
chose
but
to
I
come out
mean,
ahead. And I want to know in a competitive situation post his dominant era now, when he's placed in that situation again, would he make that same decision? Because if
yeah.
he does, that tells me there's been no growth.
So that then therefore closes the door on him being in your top five.
That diminishes it a little bit.
Okay.
That is firmly in the cons column for him, right? That takes away from his from why he can't be necessarily in the top 4 or 5. But actually, even that ultimately doesn't fully take you out of it because Michael Schumacher's in my top
Oh, I was just gonna
five,
say that. Like,
right?
okay,
But
yeah.
Schumacher's in my top five, but he's not the greatest of all time for me,
Oh, oh.
despite despite all of his stats and stuff. Because
It's not
he
just
did
about the stats, yeah.
he did some dodgy things, man, and they have a big bearing on where I can place Michael Schumacher. You know,
Okay, listen, though I would say this. I mean, you can attribute some of this to the fact that when you're going for your first championship, and yeah, now we're talking about driver characteristics and attributes that are more on a psychological sort of just sort of your personality level, right? And not every driver, there are multiple ways to get to the same point, right? So I feel like you're being a little bit unfair there, but I take your point and I say, okay, fair enough. But can the statistics get overwhelming to a point where you're like, okay, it is now undeniable, right? Because
yeah.
if
So
we could have the same discussion with Lewis and say, okay, if Lewis wins the eighth, it's over, right? At that point, it's over, correct? It's
yeah,
over,
but
right? So the
okay,
statistics do become
yeah,
overwhelming.
yeah, yeah. But okay. So first of all, Schumacher is the ideal example here, right? That on bare statistics, he should be top 1 or 2. Actually, for me, he is in the top 2. Right? Like just caveat, he is there. But that's not just because he's won 7 championships and won 91 races and had 68 poles. That's not my reason. My reason for Schumacher being there is because he could have stayed at Benetton in 95 and won a championship there. The team there knew that, but he chose to make his life difficult. And he went to Ferrari and he built that. He was the cornerstone that allowed Ross Brawn to come over, for Rory Byrne to come over and build that team into a championship winning team. And against, the likes of Adrian Newey at McLaren, so being no doubt about how huge that is. And he was able to then capitalize on that and turn it into a juggernaut that was unbeatable. And he also came in and changed what it meant to be a Formula One driver. He brought new levels of fitness, commitment, ambition. Like for him, it was a badge of honor to turn up at a podium and be able to jump up and celebrate, whereas others
So,
were dying on their feet, right? So there's that, and there's the fact that he was able to win it in 2 different teams and not necessarily a dominant team. It became dominant afterwards, but to win that 2000 title was not Ferrari at their pomp, right?
okay.
So
So,
but
but
he was so he's in there because of that,
mm,
because of what he was able to do as a Formula One driver and what he was able to build at a team like
okay.
Ferrari.
So So Max doesn't have the same traits, right? And that's okay too. But let me ask you this question. Let's say everything you said about Schumacher, let's just say it comes with 2 less world championships. Are you still putting him in your top 2? 3 less? Are you still
Well, it depends where those titles came. Like, is it so? I'm like,
my my
look,
point my
the
point
problem,
to
the
you
problem
is
is though, right? This is about how he won those titles, right?
correct. Absolutely.
Right. And had he won 8 titles, for example,
But
he would still be in that conversation. He would obviously be in
but
that conversation.
but this is why I want to push back on your argument about statistics are not everything, right? Because the statistics by itself are not everything, but they tell a story, right? And every win is going to have a different story. Every world championship is going to have a different story. Every world championship is going to have a different
Yeah,
formula that got
yeah,
you there,
yeah, but
including
he
luck,
did. The
circumstances,
problem is, though,
everything.
as soon as you start talking about what if he hadn't, but he did. So
Correct.
you
Fair
can't
enough.
take that out of it. He
I'm
did
not
those
saying that,
things.
but that's what
So
that's what I'm just saying. In the same way that you cannot take it out there, the fact that someone has won four championships, five championships, six championships, then it starts to become overwhelming in the sense that sure, it is you're not just doing
you are
you're
in
not in
that
that. You're
conversation.
in
Yeah,
that
you're
conversation.
in that
That's
conversation.
it. That's what I meant.
But
Yeah.
but for the same reason that Vettel is not in that conversation for me, like he cannot be top four or five because after you look at the completion of his career,
I
I
agree.
can't hand on heart say that he can be in that
No,
conversation against the likes of Schumacher, Hamilton.
well, I
Um,
completely agree with you in part because we also saw what happened to Vettel after that period. Like I think that
exactly,
that sort of
and
bears itself out.
I don't have that. I don't have that.
That with Schumacher, correct.
And
Oh,
I don't have that with Verstappen right now. If
yes.
Verstappen was
Yeah.
to retire tomorrow, right, then actually, yeah, I actually probably would put him in
There
my
you
top
go.
four or
Yeah,
five.
that's what I'm saying.
But I don't know what he's going to do
Okay,
at the end.
but my point to you is this. He's going to win 24, right? Barring, I don't know, the world ending, right? Let's just put it that way. He's going to win 24. There's a pretty good chance he's going to win 25 as well. I mean, I know we're going to have our hopes pinned on Ferrari because between you and me, we're going to be like, yeah, I know. But if he wins five in a row, like that to me it's not seven, right? But that there is something there, right? At that point, you're like, okay, it's not easy. And if 25 ends up being competitive somehow,
Yeah, I agree. I think he probably
so
will be in my top five at that point if he's done that. But but there are still caveats about where he places on that. And look, so Lewis here is a really good example of what for me you need to have done is that he's won those seven titles, but look at what he did prior to getting into that dominant car. Like he was arguably the standout driver in 2009 when McLaren were nowhere at the beginning of that season. They still dragged a couple of race wins out of that car.
absolutely, absolutely.
And
Yeah. I mean,
and across the course of the fallow years for him, he was always there or thereabouts. He was a contender in 2010. He was arguably the best driver in 2012. Um, people are going to say, oh, you forget about Fernando Alonso. I agree. Fernando put together the greatest championship tilt that wasn't successful of anyone. But actually, if you look at how many wins and good results Lewis lost through poor pit stops, operation, and unreliability. Have a look at it. I mean, I've gone back and watched that season, so I know what happened. Right, this isn't out of thin air. Uh, but he was there or thereabouts, and then he essentially won the 2021 season, an absolute travesty that for me
I
is
kid
still
you
a
not.
black mark on Formula One.
I'm gonna have our viewers zoom to this point in the conversation.
I
Just
don't care. I don't care. Bring it. Like I'll sit here and
bring
argue
it,
that till
says Shez. Bring
I'm
it.
blue in the face because Lewis won that championship, and
Oh my God. Wait, we're not. Oh,
they took it
let's
away
bring it
from him.
back. Let's bring it back a
I,
little bit.
I actually don't think that's even particularly a controversial thing, but because I don't think I don't think that's Max's fault. It's got nothing to do with Max. Like he didn't pull the trigger. But Lewis has even said in the last month that he would have done the same thing. But this is a conversation that we're going to have at another time, another time. But he
Yes.
has shown that across that era, he was competitive
Yeah.
and he
Well,
was able to develop, right? So he came into 2016. I think 2011 and
look.
2016 were his worst seasons. Let me finish this right. Were his worst seasons, but he was still able to stay competitive. Um, and 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 he learned from what he didn't have in 2016 that he didn't have to win every single race, that he could play a percentages game, that he needed to get the best result available to him at any given point, which is what he did from 2017 onwards. And that was the game that he played in 2021. You can argue however you want. He he was the driver that barring a stewarding miscalculation,
Um,
a
okay.
human error, should have won that title.
I
That worked for him.
okay. Fair,
So
fair.
that for me is why he enters into that conversation and becomes. Ammar, like you can laugh and you can
Listen to me.
the
Just
people
one
are.
second. One second. While we're admitting human error, we should not fail to omit Baku in there too, right? Because that was human error. Okay. If we're being fair about human errors, there was someone else who made that error at the
So
restart there.
that was within Lewis's
So you
remit,
have to
right?
hold that against him too. Look, I'm not, hey, listen, for the record, I'm a
Then you could
Ferrari
talk
fan
about,
who's
but okay, but then you could talk about. Listen, we're not going to litigate the entire 2021 season, right? But if you're talking about things that were within their control, right? Lewis did not have control over what Michael Massey did.
okay. Yeah, but when he had control over the Baku restart, he didn't
Well,
execute either. So
Max had control over Sector 3 in Jeddah.
Max is not the one complaining though, right?
Max is not complaining because he was the beneficiary of an error that went against the other driver.
I, I'm
Obviously,
not arguing that. Let's just go. This seems like a good
you
point to end.
are. I think you are actually arguing about it, which is why I'm getting heated about it. But
You're getting heated, but
uh,
I'm not playing any side in this. I am the idiot Ferrari fan who's just sitting there watching all of this play out,
but
wishing
what
that
you
I was
are
debating this.
sure, what you are doing is arguing that Lewis shouldn't be considered the greatest driver of all time
Absolutely not.
because
Absolutely not.
but you are you are absolutely saying that he shouldn't be considered because he didn't win in 2021 and are
I
using
did
that
not
argument
say
about
that.
why.
I already said that the stats are so overwhelming to the point where you cannot do that. If he wins an eighth, it was over. It was over then, but
But for
it's
me,
almost all
but for
over
him winning
already.
an eighth, for him to
Well,
win an
but
eighth, for him to win an eighth,
look,
he has to overcome massive odds to do that. And if he does that, that's why he enters
yeah.
into that
No, I
he is the
mean,
greatest driver of all time, not because of the absolute, because he won an eighth. That for me isn't the reason.
no,
It's
I
why and
just
how he
said
would have
that.
done that.
Okay, let me clarify my position here because I feel like I have to defend myself here. For me, Lewis is the GOAT already, right? Because I value other things that we haven't talked about in this, or at least only have briefly touched upon, which is
Such as
race wins. He has the most, right? He has the most number of poles by a wide margin, which I'm sure at some point Max might break it, even at the rate that he's going. But having 100 plus, so all those things matter a lot. When I'm putting greatest, I am using a lot of statistical evidence. The reason being, I look at statistics as an entry into a story, right? And over the course of the season, there are many factors that play into every particular season. Reliability, or maybe a mechanic having a faulty wheel gun that ends up in a big pit stop, and that's the difference between winning and coming third. The Michael Massey error. I get it. The Baku restart. I put that all in there. This is all, it's not to pick on one single thing and say, because you didn't, you screwed up the restart at Baku, therefore you should not complain about it. I'm not suggesting that for 1 minute, but I also think you cannot throw it out, right? It has to all be part of that same plate of discussion. And that's why I keep coming back to, if the statistics are overwhelming, then they tell a story in and of itself that becomes undeniable. And Lewis, by the way, already has that in my mind, in my opinion. He's already the GOAT because not only has
yeah,
he got all these stats, but he's done it over different eras as well. Right.
yeah.
And
I think
so there's that. So I'm not here. This was not intended to be a Lewis
yeah,
Hamilton.
but it has become
It has
it has
become,
become
I'm
that.
gonna have to.
But that I think is where we differ, and maybe this is where we should draw the line because the difference between you and me in this is that for me, Lewis is the greatest because of all of the stuff that he's done, and it's and the evidence of all of that is that he has 7 titles. But the 7 titles isn't where I start in this. It's where it ends. For me, it's how he got there
Fair
and the
enough.
character of the way that he did that. Because Schumacher has the same number of titles, but he's not the greatest for me because of the way that he got there. And
Yeah.
and there are
So
and there are massive, huge things that Schumacher did that are amazing that should put him in that title, that should put him in
good.
the hunt for that top one or two. but there are massive cons with that as well that mean that for me he isn't. So the bold statistics aren't what decide it for me. They're the end point. They're not where I start.
Fair enough. I mean, we can we all have different starting points and ending points, and that's quite all right. All right. So to to end this Max Verstappen being in the top five discussion or not, I think we agree that he's probably on his way there, but not quite there yet. But let's see. He might go to Mercedes in 25 and win, and this whole debate might look very silly in the
Then
end.
it's yeah, but I think it's
But
beyond. I think it's beyond doubt.
that
If he goes to Mercedes and wins a title in a car that ostensibly doesn't know what to do in
then he's
2020,
GOAT. He's
yeah,
GOAT for
I
sure.
mean, yeah, forget it. Yeah, there's no one else in there.
And on that note, thank you for keeping up. If you were able to stick around the entire length, we appreciate your time. We look forward to your feedback in the comments. Please go easy on us. We're just as fanatic as you are about all of this. So, but we look forward to the feedback. Thanks for liking, subscribing, and for staying in touch. We'll see you soon.